Antonio Vivaldi. He is a composer of the Baroque era. Baroque era. That is a time period between 1600 and 1750. On the left, we have a picture of Antonio. And here he is holding a violin, and he was known as the Red Priest, as you will learn. Notice that he was born March 4th, 1678, in Venice, Italy. It's important that we know he's from Italy. Okay, I'll use my highlighter. He died in July 28th, 1741. So he had a pretty long life for that time period. He died in Vienna, Austria. We're going to read the first paragraph up here at the top, and then we're going to reflect about what we just heard. Antonio Vivaldi learned the craft of music from his father, a violinist in a church orchestra in Venice, Italy. As we find important things, then we'll underline them or highlight them in this case. So anything important in there from his father. He was a violinist. Okay. Young Antonio served in church orchestras and eventually studied for the priesthood. So he was going to work for the church. He was ordained as a priest in 1703 at the age of 25, but never served the church in a religious capacity. However, he remained active in music and served the church as a musician. So he wasn't a preacher, per se. He worked for the church, but as a musician. Paragraph 2. Vivaldi began composing sonatas for keyboard instruments around 1705. When we say keyboard instruments in this time period, it's going to be a clavier, which is a piano-like instrument, but the strings are plucked, and it makes a unique sound. You'll hear it on the recording when we get to that. A sonata is a composition for solo piano or a group of instruments, one of which is often a keyboard instrument, usually consisting of 3 or 4 movements varying in key, mood, and tempo. He also played violin in opera orchestras, developed a love of opera, and composed several operas. So what's an opera, Mr. Ostro? An opera is a drama set to music and sung by performers with orchestral accompaniment, scenery, acting, and sometimes dancing. So just like a play, but everything is sung in it. And I'm sure most of you have probably seen an opera. This was unusual and controversial for Vivaldi. Priests were not supposed to compose music for non-church related activities. So that's important. So I'm going to underline it if I were you. His first opera was performed in 1713 when he was 35 years old. I'm going to go back to blue to highlight the important stuff in the third paragraph. From 1709 through 1714, Vivaldi had the financial backing of an Italian prince in the city of Mantua, and he continued composing operas in addition to keyboard, vocal, and orchestral works. So this guy, an Italian prince, paid for him to compose operas in addition to keyboard, vocal, and orchestral works. When we say orchestral, we mean string instruments. Okay. When the prince ended his support, Vivaldi accepted a position as orchestral conductor at St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice, Italy, the same church and orchestra in which his father had played violin. He held this position for 27 years, so a big chunk of his life. He also served as the director of musical conservatory in Venice. And this is a vocabulary word. Any of the bold words are going to be vocabulary words. A conservatory is specifically a school of music or dramatic art. A school of music or dramatic art. In this case, obviously, it's a school of music. In this case, you can think of it as Hogwarts, but for musicians. I'm going to go ahead with the next paragraph. By 1719, when he was 41, another wealthy patron. What's a patron, Mr. Ostro? A patron is specifically a man or woman who supports or protects something, such as an orchestra, a composer, or an event, or a cause. In this case, a patron is somebody who supports financially, in this case Vivaldi. So a wealthy person who would want to sponsor Vivaldi, in the same way we have athletes who have sponsors, but in this case it would be an individual person, usually royalty, who would be a wealthy person, sometimes of the church, in this time period, that would sponsor them. For the next several years, he composed operas for opera companies. That's kind of self-evident what it is, but I'm going to tell you what the vocabulary definition says. Opera companies are the group that performs the opera. So again, for the next several years, he composed operas for opera companies throughout Italy, including Rome and Milan, where audiences were the most discriminating. By 1725, his compositions, including his operas, were well known throughout Europe. So his operas were well known throughout Europe. And we're going to need this information to answer the questions at the end. His music was more popular in Holland, France, and England than in Italy. So that's interesting. In his hometown, on his own turf, his music was more popular abroad than in his hometown. Many Italians were uncomfortable with an ordained priest composing operas. In fact, in 1734, one of his operas was banned in Italy because he was a priest. So one of his operas was banned because he was a priest. Let's move up. Here we go. We have 3 paragraphs remaining. The next paragraph, we're going to read this together. I'll go back to blue. Vivaldi traveled throughout Europe in the late 1730s and early 1740s and lived briefly in Holland, where his music was very popular. That might be important. Despite occasional disagreements with the church over his operas, Vivaldi remained as orchestral conductor at St. Mark's in Venice. In 1741, when he was 63 years old, he moved to Vienna, Austria, hoping to receive an offer as a court musician or a composer. A court musician is the people who compose, conduct, or perform music at the place of residence of a king, queen, leader, or dignitary. So in other words, people who compose, conduct, or perform music for royalty. That's what a court musician is. Just like you have a court jester who might tell jokes and whatnot. Rich royalty and whatnot would actually own a musician. They would pay for them to come in and write music and entertain their guests. However, he received no offers and died, unfortunately, in Vienna. Next paragraph. After Vivaldi's death, his music was rarely performed until the 20th century. That sounds important. When musicians and audiences rediscovered it. During his lifetime, he was known as an opera composer. Today, while his operas are again being performed, his orchestral works are most popular. That's interesting. So he was known for his operas, but today his orchestral works are more popular, meaning music for an orchestra, for string instruments. Vivaldi claimed to have written 94 operas, but musical scholars have found scores for only 50. That's a lot. Next paragraph. Antonio Vivaldi was a pleasant man with a full head of bright red hair. For this, he was sometimes referred to as the Red Priest. That sounds important. He was comfortable writing music for both religious and concert performances. So even though people didn't want him to write what we call secular music, he would write both. He would write music for the church, and he would write just music for fun, which in this time period was unusual. We have a neat little quote over here. We're going to read that together. Igor Stravinsky did not enjoy Vivaldi's music. He called Vivaldi a dull fellow who would compose the same music over and over. Now, Igor Stravinsky is one of the last composers we'll study, so there's always a quote underneath the picture with the date of birth and the date of death. Let's go ahead on to the next page at this point. The second page that you have here will always show you some facts about them. In particular, Vivaldi was known for writing, and he composed these things. He wrote for orchestra. Music for orchestra specifically would include string instruments, obviously. He also would write concerto music. And when I say concerto music, that is a musical work for solo instrument, sometimes alone, sometimes with an accompaniment of one or more instruments. And an example could be a concerto for clarinet with orchestra. And so that would be music that would feature the clarinet and have a string orchestra in the background supporting them. He also wrote keyboard music. Now it says keyboard, not piano, because at this time period the piano was not invented. Opera, we said that's like a play but with singing throughout the entire thing, no talking. And then choral music, of course, a choir. Some other interesting facts here. We call these factoids. Vivaldi wrote more than 500 concertos. Boy, that sounds important, so I'm going to highlight that. Of which over 230 are for violin and string orchestra. He also composed concertos for many unusual instruments, including mandolin, recorder, and viola d'amore, a string instrument with as many as 14 strings. Vivaldi popularized the cello, very important, and string bass as solo instruments by composing concertos for both. So he would write music that would feature the cello and the double bass, or the string bass as we call it. And those are obviously, a cello is a larger violin, and a string bass is the biggest violin. We use the string bass in jazz band. It does the walking bass. Makes that cool sound. And in this time period, of course, they used it with a bow so that they could strum the notes. Until that time, neither instrument was considered suitable as a solo instrument. Johann Sebastian Bach transcribed many of Vivaldi's violin compositions for harpsichord, which is another string instrument. So there's a connection between another dead guy named Bach, which we'll study, of course, as well. Let's scroll up a little. 1678 was the birth of Vivaldi. And there's some other interesting facts on here. You can read them to yourself and see what happens. Let's see. In this time period, Tsar Peter the Great decrees that the new year in Russia will begin January 1st instead of September 1st. In 1704, young composer Johann Sebastian Bach actually walked 200 miles. This is cool, so I'm going to highlight that. He walks 200 miles to hear a piece of music directed by the composer Dietrich Buxtehude. Some other interesting things down here. Birth of Paul Revere, an American patriot, in 1735. And in 1741, the death of Antonio Vivaldi. Georg Friedrich Handel composed Messiah, which was an oratorio, which means a religious opera. So that is what is happening in the world. Let's go to the next page. Okay, on this page we are going to listen to a recording of one of Vivaldi's pieces. One of the most famous ones that we know about is called Spring from the Four Seasons. So the title of the piece, the main name is The Four Seasons, and we're going to listen to the movement called Spring. So let's read it. Spring is from the Four Seasons, the first four of a series of 12 concertos for violin and string orchestra, written around 1725 by Antonio Vivaldi. So it's going to feature the violin primarily, and you'll hear the orchestra in the background, so it will be a violin concerto. The other movements are summer, fall, and winter. So this is, think of the movements in music like chapters in a book. And were you to go listen to this piece, you would be asked to hold your applause between the movements, and each movement would have, the conductor would keep his or her hands up. They would pause briefly, and the orchestra might do a page turn and go on to the next movement. So really think of each one of these movements as a chapter in a book. So summer obviously will sound like summer, fall will sound like fall, winter like winter, and spring should probably be jubilant and happy, and that'll sound like spring. They are one of the first examples of what has become known as program music. This is an important term here, which is the musical representation of an idea or the musical suggestion of a mood. So it either gives you it makes you happy, like spring would be happy. Winter probably would not be very happy, although if you're from Florida, you probably would be happy in the winter. And maybe it also might tell a story. So just like the movie Fantasia by Disney, there are videos where the music tells a story, and of course the music, there are no words in it, but they put art to it. They were able to draw scenes and tell stories through illustration. In this case, the music represents the seasons of the year. Some composers during the 17th and 18th centuries actually included the imitation of sounds such as bird calls, thunder, or lightning in their music. So we might hear some of those things being imitated by instruments. For the four seasons, Vivaldi wrote descriptive notes and sonnets, which relate to the music in the margin of the musical score. So he actually wrote in his music that this is supposed to sound like birds. This should sound like thunder, etc. This is the first stanza of the sonnet Spring, found in the margin of Vivaldi's score. So he actually wrote this in here. Joyful spring has arrived. The birds welcome it with their happy songs, and the brooks and the gentle breezes flow with a sweet murmur. Well, that sounds pretty happy. And although that sounds like weird language to us, because nowadays we speak plain English, in this time period that was pretty normal. The full ensemble begins playing the melody, so this is what we're going to hear. Then only two violins will play, so we're going to listen for that. I want you to raise your hand when you hear just the two violins playing. So we have an order here that we're supposed to do. I'm going to put this in yellow. Okay, second part they want us to do. Can you hear any sounds you might hear in the spring, such as the imitation of birds? So we're going to listen for birds, gentle breezes, a thunderstorm, or even possibly a barking dog. Okay, we're going to scroll up just a little bit here, and this is going to be the timing of the music. So when I hit play, we should be able to follow along with it. Okay, here we go. This piece is performed by the strings and harpsichord. So it's going to do it softer this time. Repeated it. Here's a new melody. Then it repeats it, this time softer. Notice the harpsichord underneath it. You listen to it pounding out quarter notes. It's that tingy sound. Here we are at this part. So we hear two solo violins. That's what makes it a concerto. And they are embellishing the melody. First electric guitar solo here. And this was cool in their time period. So now we come back to the second melody played again. Right here we are listening for the moving string lines with the harpsichord playing steady chords in the background. There's the harpsichord playing faster. Now the second melody is played again. Now our low string instruments in an agitated manner. So this might be a thunderstorm. Violin solo. Shredding. So we have our cello and double bass versus the violin. And according to Antonio Vivaldi, that is what spring sounds like. And sometimes there are showers, there is rain during the spring. Okay, let's go ahead and finish our worksheet now that we have listened to Vivaldi's piece. We know some factoids about his time period, and of course we read about his life. So, up here where it says name, put your name. My first name again is Mr. Ostro. First name Mr., last name Ostro. The directions say, place the letter or the correct answer in the space provided. For true or false questions, you are to print true or false in the space provided. And you're going to spell out the whole word, or I won't know what you answered. Number 1, in addition to being a composer, Vivaldi was also active as is A, a singer, B, a mystic, C, a priest, or D, all of the above. Boy, that's a really easy one, so I'm going to leave that one blank and let you do that. But whatever answer you put, you need to circle your answer and then put it on the line with a capital letter. I'll help you with number 2. True or false, Vivaldi's operas were popular throughout all of Europe. Remember, they weren't as popular in his hometown in Italy, but they were popular abroad in many other countries. So the answer here is true. Number 3, after Vivaldi's death, his music was rarely performed until the, let's see, remember it wasn't performed until much, much later. So in this case, it was letter D, the 20th century. So I'm going to put a D here. And over here, you're going to circle D. And that tells me that you understand that the answer is D. And you have circled it over here. Sometimes your D's look like A's. I have no idea what you wrote. During his lifetime, Vivaldi was best known for his blank. Today, however, his blanks are more popular. So let's see. He was best known for his A or B during his lifetime. Well, that's an easy one as well. He was known for his operas, so we're going to put A. We're not going to circle over here on this one. Today, however, his orchestral works are more popular. And of course, what we listen to, his spring movement from the seasons, is an orchestral work, meaning for orchestra. Let me scroll up. Vivaldi composed blank. Is it A, music for church services, B, music for non-church activities, C, both A and B, or D, neither? Well, the answer here is C. Remember, he was comfortable, is what it said, writing for both, even though other people might not be, specifically people in the church system. Number 6, true or false, Vivaldi had several patrons who supported him. You can do that one. Number 7, of Vivaldi's more than 500 concertos, over 200 are for what instrument and string orchestra? Is it A, violin, B, viola d'amore, C, cello, or D, string bass? I'll give you a hint. You can find that on the factoids page. Number 8, the listening example, the Four Seasons is it A, an opera, B, an oratorio, C, a concerto, or D, an overture? You can find that answer on the 3rd page where we did our listening. It said right on it and it included the definition. Number 9, Vivaldi popularized what 2 instruments as solo instruments? We found this on our factoids page. Is it A, cello and string bass, B, organ and piano, C, violin and viola, or D, harpsichord and clavier? Well, the answer here is, and I told you I'd give you some, but not all of them, so number 9, the answer is A, cello and string bass. Mr. Ostro's favorite string instrument is definitely the cello. It looks like jello, but it starts with a C. Let's scroll up. Only 2 left here. We got a bonus on here. Number 10, the musical representation of an idea or a mood is known as blank. Very important word that you know, because when we play band music, I'll sometimes ask you what is the mood here? Should we be happy? Should we be sad? How do we play this musical sentence, this musical phrase? If we were telling a story with the music, what would we be telling with the music? Otherwise, we're just playing notes in time. Music needs to be expressive. So the answer here is actually found on the 3rd page, the one with the listening, and we're going to write C, program music. There you go. Bonus, Vivaldi served as orchestral conductor at what famous cathedral in Venice, Italy? This came up 2 or 3 times on the 1st page when we talked about his biography. So that was St. Mark's Cathedral. Remember, his dad even played there. That's quite a bit of information about Vivaldi. We'll learn more as we progress, and Of course, I recommend that you look up more of his tunes. You can find Vivaldi on the internet. You can find him on YouTube. You can find him in colleges performing them. You can find professional orchestras performing his works even today. Any violinist that you know of, a professional violinist, will have, of course, played a violin concerto or two by Vivaldi. So I hope you look him up.